nice kind of recap at the end of the day. So today we're going to go deeper into the planetary environments, and not necessarily only on the Earth or Mars. A lot of it is very generic, hopefully. We hope so. So there is life on other rocky planets in the galaxy. But there is a lot to discuss, and this is where we start to really overlap with what we're going to discuss on Thursday and Friday, which is the periodic chemistry and actually the chemical functions that we're trying to understand in cells, in life in general. So let's start with the first talk by David Catling, who really captures in his title what this day is about: environments at the origin of life. David.
Okay, thank you. So this talk is about how the atmosphere and the environment of the Earth could have provided some of the important molecules for life to begin. And I'll just acknowledge my co-workers. So a couple of postdocs in my group have posters here: Zoe Todd, Sebastian Haas. I'll also be mentioning work by my grad student Nick Wogan, and then I have some other collaborators listed below. So here's an overview of what I will talk about. The talk has three parts. First of all, I'll talk about some background for people who are from other disciplines, the motivation and context. But what we're trying to address in the origin of life problem is, how did geochemistry become biochemistry? And I'm going to argue that a reducing early atmosphere, at least a transient one, was a plausible source of organics on the early Earth. That laboratory chemistry points to cyanide as being important, and wet-dry cycles and a need for photons. And then I'm going to go into a little more detail on the reducing atmospheres and how they can be produced. And then finally, I'm going to talk about environments that are actually suitable for organic synthesis because they can concentrate reactants and allow the wet-dry cycles. So, motivation and context, part one. So my starting point is this idea I mentioned, that the origin of life is how geochemistry becomes biochemistry. But we also have to think what life is. And this is a sort of working definition, that it's a genome-containing chemical system in a physically bounded volume that has evolved and is self-sustaining in a suitable environment. So it's not just about catabolism, it's not just about self-replication, and it's not something without a history. So hence the past tense, all life has some history. And also, I've emphasized genome in red here, because genome is a crucial characteristic of life. Many things have some sort of metabolism, like a fire or a car, but they don't have a genome, they're not alive. So we need environments that are conducive to making genomes, and in particular, there are reasons to think that RNA genome came before a DNA genome, and in particular RNA can be catalytic, a ribozyme. So we need to make the monomers of RNA, which are ribonucleotides, shown here on the left. We start with chemicals that are available in the environment. These can be called feedstocks. They feed into prebiotic chemical schemes. And we need to make the important components of biochemistry, so also the amino acids to make peptides and proteins, fatty acids to make membranes, and the protocell. Start over here, simple things, start over there, and we get over there to a protocell. One of the reasons for emphasizing the components of RNA is that there's evidence, vestiges in modern biochemistry, that ribonucleotides, the monomers of RNA, were present in an earlier metabolism. So this was proposed a long time ago, back in the 1970s, that coenzymes, these non-protein parts of enzymes, show that there are in fact moieties of RNA present in today's enzymes. So you can see on the right there, that's from a recent paper, there are these parts of enzymes that basically are nucleobase or nucleotide in their form. And this was put forward by Harold White. He said a metabolic system composed of nucleic acid enzymes existed prior to the evolution of ribosomal protein synthesis, modern protein synthesis, that the protein-based parts evolved later. And then, of course, there's the fact that peptides come from the ribosome today, so the ribosome comes first, the RNA. So we want to make RNA. What do the lab experiments tell us, and what do we know from planetary science? Well, this table talks about environmental needs, what can be made from these basic chemicals on the left, and then various papers that support what's in the table. And basically, all of these schemes that are reported in these various papers start with nitriles. So they have a CN group, like the simplest one being hydrogen cyanide. And the way this works is that cyanide is what's called a nucleophile, so it attacks a carbon in an organic species and basically adds the carbon and the nitrogen to that molecule. And you can do it again and again and again. That makes bigger and bigger molecules. If they become big, they can sometimes spontaneously cyclize, so they make the rings that you need for the nucleobases. But where on earth would these cyanides, these nitriles, come from? Well, in planetary science, we know on Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, that the air there, which is mostly nitrogen but minor methane, makes nitriles just naturally from the photochemistry. And there are some things listed here, like cyanacetylene, which is used to make the pyrimidines, and used stoichiometrically, so you need plenty of it. That doesn't really have a plausible source other than atmospheric. We also need phosphate, of course, for the nucleotides. That's part of those molecules, and that has to come from the solid Earth, from rocks. Now the question is, did we ever have something resembling a Titan-like atmosphere on the early Earth? This is also called a Miller-Urey atmosphere because Stanley Miller, picture shown there, together with his PhD advisor, published this paper, very famous paper about having a reducing atmosphere in a flask and this kind of apparatus, putting a spark through it and making amino acids, including 10 or 14 with tweaks of the 20 protein-forming amino acids. At the same, later, we knew that in the 1970s from remote observations that HCN was present on Titan, and then this was confirmed by the Voyager 1 mission. However, at the same time, more or less at the same time as the Miller-Urey paper, a few years from that, geoscientists were sort of killjoys to this idea. They said, well, hang on, we know when we look at modern volcanoes, so that's on the right there, that supply the atmosphere over geologic time, the gases are oxidized, like CO2 or nitrogen, instead of CH4 or ammonia. And the most of the gas that comes out of volcanoes is water vapor, so that it's basically steam instead of hydrogen, the oxidized form of hydrogen, water vapor. And the kind of air that you have from the oxidized gases is not so conducive, or not conducive at all, to making the cyanides. So the geoscientists developed this kind of dogma that the early atmosphere was only oxidizing, that the Miller-Urey atmosphere was wrong. But the need for cyanides never went away in prebiotic synthesis. It was always the best way, perhaps the only way, the realistic way to make the nucleobases. Most people accept, I do, that for most of the time, the early atmosphere probably was rich in nitrogen and CO2, the oxidized gases. We can ask the question how much CO2 was around, because that was important for the greenhouse effect and the pH of the early ocean. And the way we can address that is with models of the carbon cycle. Basically, CO2 comes out of volcanoes, it dissolves in water to make a weak acid, carbonic acid. That reacts with silicate rocks, releases cations, and in the cycle, the carbon dioxide can be removed in this weathering cycle and put into limestone, or if you weather the seafloor and release calcium, then you get calcium carbonate veins and crystals in the seafloor. And this is actually a thermostat, because if the world is warm, then the weathering happens faster, the hydrological cycle is speeded up, and so the CO2 is removed more efficiently and lowers the temperature. And if it's really cold, then the hydrological cycle has slowed down, CO2 builds up because volcanism is independent of that. So we can model the carbon cycle, and we've done it for recent geological history, and all we did is just, well, let's extend that way back into the past, into the Hadean, before 4 billion years ago. But we have to add in impacts, because there are many of them on the early Earth, and the impacts create a lot of ejecta, which is very easily weathered by carbonic acid, and it acts as a big sink. And in fact, when you run these models, the control line, dashed, is what you get without the impacts, and when you add the impacts, the median solution actually makes the early Earth cold. But there's huge uncertainty, which is the 95% confidence interval is shown in the orange, but the median is generally cold or temperate. So that's the kind of background atmosphere. We could also ask the question, where did life originate? And if you read the literature, there are many ideas. Some people argue deep sea ocean vents, some people argue the surface, such as hot springs or cold lakes, or just ones that are not so icy. Our approach has been to take account of what the lab prebiotic chemistry needs to work. And this is kind of a complicated table, but basically what it does is it looks at problems in the origin of life, how they don't work in the deep ocean, and how they do work in a surface environment. So one of the problems is that you need to have concentrated reactants to drive a reaction from the left to the right. And the ocean is obviously very dilute. But a lake or something like that can evaporate and can concentrate reactants. If we need cyanides and they're present in the atmosphere, it needs to go in to solution and be concentrated, and the ocean ends up being problematic. And in fact, there are no papers that I know of that de novo make nucleobases under deep sea vent conditions, but there are many papers, I quoted them earlier, for surface environments that are in contact with the atmosphere. There's the condensation problem, that's Le Chatelier's principle, which is if you want to make polymers and they release water, then being in a lot of water is bad for that. You don't get that reaction moving to the right, but if you're in a dry environment or an environment that can dry up, then you can shift that reaction to the right. Amino acids can become peptides, nucleotides can become nucleic acids, and there are papers where this has been done. There's a phosphate problem. So in most natural waters, phosphate is a very low concentration, such as micromoles, but the lab experiments use molar concentrations frequently, or at least tens, hundreds of millimolars. And that's because phosphate forms an insoluble mineral, apatite, calcium phosphate. But lake environments can solve this problem because they can concentrate phosphorus, because the calcium can get removed into other minerals and the phosphorus can accumulate. Surface environments also have UV, which can select certain molecules and can also activate reactions. Of course, that's not going to happen in the deep ocean. We can also, apart from where, we can ask when did life originate? And this is a kind of schematic, but basically there are clear signs of life in the geologic record by 3.5 billion years ago, probable life 3.8, possible life 4.1 billion years ago. So the time of interest is probably in the Hadean, so before 4 billion years ago. So that was the kind of background introduction. And now let's delve into a little more detail. So, millenary atmospheres, how could have they occurred if generally the background atmosphere was nitrogen and CO2 on the early Earth? Well, Harold Urey had this idea back in the 1950s that impactors, which we know would have hit the early Earth, would have actually created such atmospheres temporarily. So impactors contain iron-nickel alloy if they're big enough in their core. The iron reacts with water, the ocean, and makes hydrogen. And then if you have enough hydrogen around in the thermochemistry after the impact, CO2 will be reduced to methane. And that's how you make a millenary atmosphere. And he said that he thought it was inevitable because we know this must have happened, these big impactors in the early Earth. Another thing which he didn't mention is that the steam that's produced can also react with the crust and also make hydrogen. like it's not actually necessarily dependent upon the amount of iron in the impactor. So we decided to run with that idea and model it. The way we do that is here's our early Earth planet on the left. We hit it with an impactor. We create a steamy atmosphere. We run the thermochemistry in a kinetics model. Once the steam collapses back, we then basically run photochemistry, and photochemistry generates something like a Titan atmosphere, except it's sort of Titan on steroids because there's 100 times as many photons coming in to the Earth's atmosphere as compared to Titan. So here's an example of quite a big impact, 1,000 kilometers. Basically, time zero is when we have this impact. We start with our nitrogen CO2 atmosphere. We generate a lot of hydrogen, about 8 bars, in this case 8 to 9 bars. Steam collapses after about 1,000 years, and then as we run forward in the photochemical scheme, we generate hydrogen cyanide. Most of that dissolves in rainwater, or becomes mixed in rainwater and goes to the surface, so that sort of suppresses the mixing ratio in the atmosphere. But there's this constant stream for millions of years, so this is a long-term generation of this molecule. And here's a simulation of the photochemical part of that model, so that's after the steam has collapsed. This is a very tall atmosphere because it's rich in hydrogen, so we go up in altitude above 1,000 kilometers. But as the hydrogen escapes, the atmospheric height will collapse, as you'll see in this simulation. And we generate a haze, like in Titan's atmosphere, and we generate HCN, like in Titan's atmosphere. But it's somewhat different because we've got some CO2 in the background, and we also generate carbon monoxide, things that don't exist on Titan. So let's run this forward in time, which is ticking at the top in thousands of years. Remember, this is a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, except we're losing hydrogen, so the surface pressure is going down. The atmospheric scale height is decreasing. We're oxidizing the methane to carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is now quite rich. And then the atmosphere collapses to a small scale high at the end. All of this is happening over a time scale of millions or 10 to the 7, tens of millions of years. So large asteroid impacts would have made methane and consequently cyanide. We've got an initial paper on that, and my student is busily running models and will write some papers coming out probably next year, where we're considering how smaller impacts can be effective because they have nickel catalysis to make the methane. So then what? We make these molecules, what happens to them? Where would these feedstocks collect and concentrate? And I want to argue that carbonate-rich lakes are plausible and promising in the third part of my talk. So I've done all that, blanked out in grey, and now I'm going to talk about a lake or pond setting. Remember, this solves the concentration problem, the condensation problem, and I'm going to argue the phosphate problem of the origin of life. I want to argue that sodium carbonate lakes should form on early land. Now, when I talk about this, sometimes people say, well, how do we know that there was early land on the Earth? We know that the oldest sedimentary rocks from Greenland, you can find beach gravel there. That's been known since the 1970s. If there was beaches, there was land. If we go back further, then we don't have such good evidence, but there's a recent review by Koranaga, was there land on the early Earth? And he argues that there were certainly ocean islands that the high heat flow could push up cool seamounts above the sea level, and they could last for tens of millions of years, and then how much continental crust would be exposed is model dependent. We don't need huge areas of land. Today there are 10 to the 8 lakes between 20 meters squared and 100 times 100 meters squared. So even if we had 1% of modern land, we'd still have a million lakes of this size, and that's just ignoring puddles also. When you weather volcanic rocks with carbonic acid or other acids, you release cations like sodium or calcium, and you'll also make carbonate ions. And very often you'll find that the carbonate ions, multiplied according to charge, will exceed the 2+ cations. So when you run this forward geochemically, the carbonates will precipitate, remove the divalent cations, and you'll evolve towards sodium carbonate lakes. And data shows that. So the data is plotted here. I've ignored sulfur, crossed that out because sulfate comes from the oxidizing part of the weathering on modern Earth, which didn't exist back then. And in the shaded part of that diagram, we have these conditions from volcanic rivers and lakes where we're often saturated in carbonate. Sodium carbonate lakes solve this million-fold phosphate problem of the origin of life, where the natural waters mostly have very low levels, but the lab prebiotic chemistry needs higher levels. And what happens is that the calcium carbonate removes the calcium, and it stops the phosphate being lost into calcium phosphate apatite. We looked at lakes all around the world, and here they are plotted, and found that the phosphate levels correlate with the dissolved inorganic carbon. And up in the corner here, these are some lakes in Canada called Good Enough and Last Chance Lake. And this picture is a picture of Last Chance Lake in Canada. It sits on top of flood basalts, and it evolved towards a sodium carbonate lake, as I just explained how that should happen. And it's, as far as we know, it's the lake with the highest phosphate levels in the world, up to 40 millimolars. And here's a student for scale. And here's some more students for scale. And this is actually the same image, but this is a different time. So this was November, where it's icy. This is September, the end of the dry season, and it's dried up here. If you want to know more about this, then have a look at Sebastian Haas's poster. Why is this lake the most phosphate lake, rich lake in the world? You can also do models of these kind of water chemistries. So we start with a kilogram of water on the x-axis, and we remove the water in the computer model, and we see how the water evolves. And as it evolves, we precipitate things out indicated at the top of this graph, so the carbonates. And with cyanide in the system, we end up precipitating out ferrocyanides. So the iron tends to form a complex with the cyanide. So we can actually stockpile these reagents through evaporation on the early Earth. If you stockpile them, how would you release them? Well, after a lake is dried up, you can have shock or contact metamorphism, in other words, heating, or you could have UV, and that will release the cyanide for your prebiotic schemes. So we've got various papers that have been looking at this and the conditions for prebiotic chemistry in such lakes, and the work continues. And there's a nice paper by Dimitar that kind of summarizes this concept. Okay, yeah. So this is an even more complicated diagram than the ones I've shown previously. But basically, if you start at the top by making a rocky planet, you can then get to a post-impact reducing atmosphere, the Miller-Urey atmosphere, that can generate components you need, the critical component being cyanide, that then feeds into the schemes below, and you can generate phosphate from weathering of rocks and concentrate it in the right locations. And now you have everything, along with some sulfur from volcanoes, you have everything you need to go down these paths. And each of these paths to make peptides, sugars, nucleotides, or lipids has justification in the prebiotic chemistry literature. Each of these arrows, I could find a paper where somebody's done something in the lab that's relevant, such as phosphorylation, or such as making aminonitrites, for example, Matt Power's work, or making lipid vesicles that then encapsulate ribonucleotides or RNA. So what I've talked about is really the beginning of this, making the right kind of chemicals and having the right kind of setting to concentrate things. But this is kind of expected on the early Earth. We expect basaltic terrains, we expect them to be weathered, we expect them to produce the kind of conditions that could have led to the origin of life. And this would be true also for other rocky worlds, so it bodes well for other rocky worlds. So to conclude, this is another kind of overview diagram, which I did on a whiteboard with my colleagues from the Simons Foundation, but I've rearranged it slightly. And it basically shows how the different disciplines that probably represented here in this meeting astronomy, geochemistry, prebiotic chemistry, and biology feed into this problem. And I've just talked about more or less the geochemistry side of things. And of course, there's much more to the right. But first of all, we start with a planet that's necessary for biopoiesis, the origin of life. That's a word for the origin of life. So biopoic planet, that's different from a habitable planet, probably requires more conditions than just being habitable liquid water. And then we move to a stage of prebiotic chemistry, self-replicating entities, and then finally things like code optimization that gets you to the last universal common ancestor. So I just talked about the very beginning of this. To make life, we have to make an entity with a genome from environmental chemicals. RNA is critical, contains information, does catalysis. Titan gives an example of reducing atmospheres that make cyanides. That can be done in these transient post-impact atmospheres. Then reagents can be concentrated in surface environments, and that basically sets you up to move towards the prebiotic part of this diagram. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you, Vincent from the University of Minnesota. Nowadays, in already research, magnesium is an essential ion in the cytoplasm, interacting with ribosomes, sterilizing ribosomes, DNA, and so on. And calcium is more signaling ions. Can you tell us about this, or does your work inform about this transition between magnesium and calcium, and the difference that we see nowadays in the role that they play in living cells? I saw that you had a graph at some point where calcium and magnesium are exactly the same. They follow the same curve when you remove the water, or you concentrate on those two ions. So what does your work say about that, and does it say something about that, about those two ions?
Okay, well, the first thing I would say is that what I'm talking about is probably very far removed from modern biochemistry, so we're just trying to get to things that work for some prebiotic reactions. But in general, when you concentrate these waters, you want to remove the calcium because you want to concentrate the phosphate. Otherwise, the phosphate would be removed into calcium phosphate, the insoluble mineral apatite. It turns out that magnesium can be quite resistant to precipitating out as a carbonate for kinetic reasons, so the magnesium can persist. That wasn't really modeled in the thermodynamic calculations because it's thermodynamic and not kinetic. But if you did a kinetic model, it's possible that the magnesium could persist at higher concentrations for longer periods of time. One reason that we would like magnesium to be around is when you get to, the RNA stage, some of that prebiotic chemistry requires magnesium ions to work properly. So one possibility is that what I'm talking about was so early that maybe you move to a different solution later on, or it happened in somewhere adjacent, like in stream water, rather than in a lake or a lagoon or something. So it may not just be the one location where everything happens and we go from this side to that side. It may be that a lake can also be diverse. You can have lakes that in one corner have a little hydrothermal vent, say, or some volcanic vent, and are somewhat acidic over there, but they're alkaline in another part of the lake. So you can find lakes like that on early Earth. So there are ways that you could have different chemistry that may favor different parts of the prebiotic chemistry. So the simple answer is in 2 words, or 3, it's complicated.
Not to put a number on future questions, but at least. While we're waiting for people to get the courage to ask you. Very nice talk, David. I have a question about your atmosphere, post-impact atmosphere. I noticed that even for things like methane, which is a fairly heavy molecule, it extends to beyond 1,000 kilometers. Is that dependent in your model to what was the state of the Earth's magnetosphere at the time? Or is that included at all?
Well, we're not including that in the model. It's just a photochemical model of the neutral atmosphere. But when you have a hydrogen-rich atmosphere dominated by hydrogen, you just have an enormous scale height of, on the order of 100 kilometers or something. So you have to, and it's the same on of course, with Titan. It's a small body, so that makes the atmosphere extend even further. But you have to include these very high altitudes. And yeah, exactly how the gases get mixed, it's a dynamical issue, and there's probably more work to do on that. But basically, the methane, if it's at sufficient altitude, will photolize like it does on Titan. You need less than 145 nanometers that will photolize methane. Then you make radicals, and then those radicals, CH2, CH3, will combine with N from nitrogen photolysis to make HCN. So that's how it works. And that's basically an upper atmosphere phenomenon on Titan and on the early Earth. And what's interesting, though, is because it's so hydrogen-rich, even though the methane can be short-lived in other types of atmospheres, here the methane is quite long-lived with a lifetime of millions of years, because methane can reform as well, because there's so much hydrogen around. So it doesn't get destroyed on the short time scale like it does in the Earth's atmosphere. It only lasts 10 years on average. Or if you release it on Mars, it would only last 300 years on average.
Thank you.
So, I know every scientist likes his own hypotheses and concepts, but Michael Russell, he likes deep sea vents, and he claims that you can produce pretty much everything that you need, including activated nucleotides and so on in deep sea vents. So, is there any way to combine both? Deep sea vents as a kind of organic builder and land mass?
So my attitude as a scientist is to go where the evidence leads us. And as I said, there are no papers, zero, on nuclear-based synthesis under hydrothermal vent conditions. There are also no papers that actually make peptides or proteins or things like that, because from de novo, it's important to say de novo, so starting with simple molecules and then making them more complex molecules. There are some papers where under hydrothermal conditions people feed in a 3-carbon organic molecule, and maybe they make some other organic molecule like amino acids. So if there was actually a single synthesis paper, I might give Mike Russell some more credence, but in the absence of any evidence, I don't. And the other reason is there's no source of cyanide from hydrothermal vents. It's not being generated, and yet to do this chemistry requires cyanide. I haven't met a single organic chemist who actually favors the deep sea vent hypothesis. You could ask John Sutherland, Steve Bennett, Matt Pownam, who's here, any organic synthesis chemist, and they can't see how it's done. So that's the reason. Lack of evidence.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about this impactor idea. So what is the size, the typical size of impactors you get? Is it something that is going to only locally change the atmosphere, or it's like really global change of the atmosphere?
So if you want to follow Harold Urey's idea with an iron core, an iron nickel core, usually those bodies are quite big. So upwards of 50 kilometers across, maybe 100, okay? You could ask the question, how many of those impactors, and I have a bonus slide, no extra charge on this, if I can find it. Where is it? Okay. There we go. So these are some simulations we did of impacts. Impacted diameter, the lowest here is 100, up to 1,000. And I've drawn a line at 500, so if they're bigger than 500, they actually vaporize the ocean entirely. But some of these smaller ones will partially vaporize the ocean. And actually that's what we need. Some kind of steam needs to enter the atmosphere, at least partially. We want to be after the last ocean vaporizing impact because that will sterilize the Earth, right? So it's no good having like that one or that one. You have to be after the last ocean vaporizing impact. And the cratering record of the moon and our constraints are sufficient, and this is a stochastic process, so these are different realizations of possible impact records just going by here. And sometimes you have a late ocean vaporizing impact, and sometimes there might be a few cases where you don't have one at all, but there's usually 0 to 4 or something. So what we're envisaging is that it's one of the larger impactors after the last ocean vaporizing impact that sets up the origin of life. And then there are still big impacts after that, but they wouldn't be big enough to kill off life once it got started, which would be a bad thing.
Thank you.
And last question,
If one assumes that some of the processes occurred on the surfaces, how it will affect your model?
That's a good question. And it's not something that I've been looking at, the surface catalysis, but there are papers in the literature and there are other people working on that problem. So for example, Alexis Templeton at the University of Colorado is working on looking at surfaces and different minerals and how they can, for example, help with polymerization. So I think surfaces is quite important. It's also important, actually, one area that is important that we have looked at is the generation of methane after this post-impact. So it's much better if you do that catalytically. And there's something that asteroids deliver, which is nickel, along with the iron, that is known in industry to be a catalyst for methane production from H2 plus CO2, reducing the CO2 to methane. And we have modeled that. I just haven't shown you those results yet because they're very preliminary. And using that, we can actually, the smaller impacts become much more effective at generating HCN. So it is important, but it's quite a difficult area of chemistry, which is partly why I avoided it.
On that note, thank you very much, David. Let's thank David again. Our next speaker is Paul Rimmer from Cambridge University, and Paul is going to continue on that topic.